Good day everyone, and welcome to another video. Today we're talking about how your thoughts or how you're thinking without even knowing it. How your thoughts or some of your thoughts are generated or appear to you without you knowing really where they come from. So most of this is actually taken from this book. Everything is taken from this book. This book is called Thinking Fast and Slow. It's written by Daniel Kahneman or Kahneman. Depends on which country you're from, how you would pronounce it. And it gives a lot of insights into psychology. I'm not big on psychology actually. I'm not fascinated that much by it, but this book was full of so much good stuff that it really captivated me. It's quite long. It's quite a big book. But what's good about it is that except for the introduction, you don't need to read anything in order. There's like 5 parts, and you can choose to read whatever you like, whatever part interests you most. So you don't actually have to read the whole book to understand what's going on. You can pick and choose kind of, which is pretty nice. So I highly recommend the book. As for the topic of today, I'm gonna tell you a little story or an example about a guy named Steve. Tell you about Steve. We're going to be mentioning System 1 and System 2 that I'm gonna explain a bit. And I'm also gonna tell you what is the best time of day for you to have your parole meeting in order for you to have the highest chance of success with that. So first off, let's start off with Steve. And Steve is actually an example that is also given in the book. And so in the book, he describes a person named Steve as very shy, very orderly, and very detail-oriented and organized. And then he asks if Steve, this very meek and tidy personality type, if he's more likely to be a farmer or a librarian. Where are you most likely to find this guy, Steve? Most of us would answer librarian. I would have guessed librarian, and it's wrong. Steve, even though he's organized and tidy and all of this kinds of stuff, is actually more likely to be a farmer. Now, how is this possible? Well, it's a statistical issue that our brain is famously very bad at managing. So there are a lot more farmers than there are librarians, and because of the sheer amount of farmers, the likelihood of finding this personality type or the amount of farmers that end up having this personality type will still outnumber the number of librarians, even if in our mind it's more typical for a librarian to have this personality. Now, what is interesting is that even if you point out to people and you ask this question, if Steve is more likely to be a farmer or a librarian, if you point out to people the amount of farmers compared to the amount of librarians that there are, they will still answer librarian. And so this is actually because of something called a heuristic. I don't know if I pronounce it completely correctly, but a heuristic. And in this specific case, it's named the representative heuristic. So what is a heuristic? What the hell am I on about? Well, a heuristic is basically like a rule of thumb, or the word means like a rule of thumb that the brain uses to solve problems that the brain doesn't really have an answer to. So the representativeness heuristic is kind of the brain's go-to to answer this question. The brain doesn't know what is if Steve is more likely to be a farmer or a librarian. It doesn't really know. So how does it answer the question? Well, it uses tricks, and it kind of changes the question. Instead of answering the question what Steve is more likely to be, the brain chooses to answer the question what profession most likely or more resembles the stereotype that we have described. And that's how it comes up with the conclusion of a librarian. Even if you give the brain the information needed for the statistical solution, most people will still answer librarian. And these heuristics, there are many different kinds, and these are kind of mental shortcuts that the brain uses, and we're not aware of it really. We are aware of the end result. What we perceive is not how our thoughts were generated, but we perceive the end results of this kind of system in the brain. And there are other biases as well. Heuristic could generate quite a lot of biases. So I might use the words kind of interchangeably. There are other biases like the availability heuristic. Availability heuristic is when you judge the probability of something, or the amount or the size of something, based on how easily you can come up with examples of this. So if someone asks you how likely is a politician to maybe be unfaithful, to be dishonest and stuff like that, because of all the examples, all of the stories that we are familiar with, we will most likely guess that they are more likely to do these things than anyone else, because we have so many examples that we can use as an example to answer this question. So we equal availability of examples with size or with probability, which is incorrect. This is another form of bias that our brain does, and it's not really fair to judge people based on these biases. Doesn't necessarily mean that someone is prejudiced or that someone is misleading on purpose, but these systems, they work passively without us really being aware of them, and end up generating these biases. So as for the heuristics and these rules of thumb that the brain uses to answer unanswerable questions, we need to be quite careful with them. And it's because our own thinking tends to be hidden from us. Then the second thing that I wanted to talk about was what the author calls System 1 and System 2. System 1 is what is kind of the computation in your brain that is fast and automatic. It doesn't take any effort, and it is always on. You can also not turn it off. These are things like detecting emotion in a person's face. You cannot help but notice it. It's not you making a conscious effort necessarily. Or for example, completing the sentence bread and, most people will automatically have butter or something else appearing in their brain, bread and butter. If someone tells you 2 + 2, you cannot help but think of 4. And this is the kind of automatic, always active, low effort system 1. Another good example of this is for example a stop sign. If someone puts a stop sign in front of you, you cannot help but read it. Like, you cannot not read it because it's automatic. This is your system 1 operating with no effort, and you cannot stop it. The same way, if you hear a sound, you cannot help but notice the direction. It's not a conscious effort. You don't put effort into finding out the direction of the sound. Or you could in some scenarios, but generally if you hear a big boom, you will notice the direction without having put effort into this analysis of the situation. And so this is System 1, and this is mostly what is also responsible for our error in the example of Steve. System 1 automatically kind of jumps up and says librarian, when in fact the question or the problem requires a more deeper statistical analysis. That's where we come to System 2. System 2 is this more slow but deliberate and effortful system of our brain. So instead of answering the question 2 + 2 is 4, which comes to us automatically, if you need to answer the question, for example, 17 times 18, this would be system 2. You would have to sit down, you would have to put effort into it, and you would have to figure out what it is. System 2 also helps us make rational choices, and it also is like a control mechanism for system 1. So system 1 is always running. It constantly makes suggestions and propositions, and if there is something that kind of piques our attention or like grabs our attention, it can activate system 2 and make us think about it. So system 2 also controls impulses. It's what makes us more sociable. Like, for example, throughout the day, for sure, you maybe want to insult someone or whatever, but you don't. And this is because your system 2 makes the conscious effort to say, hey, let's think about this and let's not do that. In the same way that children that are like notorious for staring, like if a small child sees a disabled person, it's almost impossible for them not to stare. This is because they don't have the system 2 that powerful. They're not that in touch with their system 2, and they don't have the kind of force to resist. Whereas an adult or even just like a teenager, they will acknowledge, yes, the person is disabled, and make an effort not to stare, because why? There's no point in staring at them. And so this is also something for system 2. Now, what is a very important trait of this system 2, which is self-control, slow and rational and all these things, is that system 2 can get depleted. I said before that system 1 is effortless. It's always running, it's always on, and unfortunately or fortunately, depending on the situation, you cannot turn system 1 off. But system 2 is mostly almost off. Not really off, but it's kind of just nodding along until something activates it, until something makes you think. So the problem is that system 2 gets tired, it can fatigue, and when it gets tired, it can start to fail. So the way these two interact, system 1 and system 2, is what I said earlier, that system 1 is always on and kind of generates impressions, and then system 2 can either accept or reject the things, and if it rejects, it needs to make the effort to correct. So even though this is also pretty reasonable. This is a lot just fancy words for things that I think most of us know intuitively as well. Just because this author put a name to it, called it system 1 and system 2, doesn't mean that we weren't already kind of aware of this. Like, everyone is aware that on a subconscious level there is a almost constant conflict between our automatic reactions and self-control. We control our automatic reactions, and this is the same, just the fancy word of saying system 1 and system 2. So about the system 2 that can get kind of depleted, that can get tired and fatigued, if it has to do a lot of tasks, let's say for example we make someone memorize a bunch of numbers. This takes up energy, this takes focus, and this takes up glucose in the brain. So if you ask someone or you make them memorize a bunch of stuff or do hard cognitive tasks, they will afterwards be more likely to eat junk food. They will make more selfish and impulsive decisions, because impulsiveness, as you remember, requires self-control, and self-control comes from system 2. And if it's tired, you will be more likely to be impulsive. If you've also asked people to do a very hard mental task or something like that, afterwards they will also be more likely to judge others superficially because of this fatigue of system 2. Now, I mentioned glucose, and glucose, you might not be aware, and this is actually not written in the book, but glucose is the main energy, or is the only energy source for the brain, really. So the brain makes up like 2% of your body weight. but it consumes something like 25% of all your glucose. So that's like a ridiculous consumption. And when your brain has to work hard, it depletes these glucose storages a little bit. You can literally, in experiments, see blood sugar level decreasing when people are doing very hard mental tasks. What does that mean? Well, it basically means that if someone has done a lot of thinking, done a lot of mental gymnastics, then their glucose will drop down and they will become more impulsive and all of these things. But this also has another implication. It also implies that by supplying glucose, by increasing the glucose, you can revert this effect. You can charge your system 2 up again. So there was this study group, Baumeister, I think it was a Baumeister study group or something like that, that they talk about in the book, that studied the effect of glucose when it comes to thinking and stuff like that. And so you could actually revert the fatigue of system 2 by just simply giving someone sugar. Now, this reminded me a lot of the advertisement of Snickers. Always the one saying like, you're not you when you're hungry, you're moody, you're this, you're that. And it's true. This is because the person's system 2 in the brain is fatigued, it's running low on glucose, and all these things like self-control, impulsivity that are controlled and regulated by system 2 that take energy are no longer that controlled anymore. And so you should eat a Snickers, basically. But this also has a lot of other implications that are more scary and more terrifying. It's not just about a person being slightly moody because they haven't had their lunch, but there was an example given about parole judges. So the judges on average, the basic setting, so to say, for their brain is to reject. This is the basic, like the standard position is to reject, and the thing that takes effort is approving someone. So what is taking effort? What is the thing in the parole application that takes mental energy from the judge is deciding who gets parole and who doesn't. So if someone would be fatigued mentally, it would be harder for them to think of and reason why this person should have parole, and they would revert to the standard of rejecting parole. Now, the average in the study that they gave, the average of parole given was a rate of 35%. 35% of cases were approved, and the rest were rejected. Now, the scary part is that as you start to compare this to the glucose levels of the judges, and don't forget, judges are like highly educated people. Most of them are extremely experienced, have done it for a while, and these are not people that you would think are subject to being easily influenced just by a few points on the sugar, the blood sugar levels. But when you check the parole applications for those applicants that were evaluated just after lunch, the percentage of approval jumps to 65%. And even worse, the approval rate just before lunch, the approval rate, like when the judge has the lowest glucose in their blood, the approval rate when they are as hungry, the most hungry that they're going to be during the day, the approval rate drops almost down to 0%. And if you ask these judges, and they did, if they asked them to explain their reasoning for why they do one thing and not the other, they give perfect reasons. They believe that they judged each application fairly. They truly believe that they did it correctly. But when we study when we plot the blood glucose to the decisions, we can see that there is this secret puppet master controlling the judges. This secret puppet master that is glucose and they're not even aware of it. They think they're judging everyone fairly. They believe they're doing it correctly. They cannot imagine that they themselves, these highly educated professionals, would be influenced by something so regular, something so insignificant. Like, everyone gets hungry during the day. It's nothing special, and surely they would not let this influence them. But subconsciously it does, because our decision making, most of it is generated hidden from ourselves, and we only get to see the result of our own decision making. We only see the result, the conclusion the brain makes. And so what this book teaches you again and again is that we rely way too much on intuitions from the system one, the one that is constantly running automatically with no effort, the one that has all these biases, the one that uses all these shortcuts to answer questions it doesn't have an answer to. And when we follow system one more than system two, or we don't activate our system two to think of the things rationally, and we just go on autopilot, the conclusions tend to come first, and the arguments later. So, and the problem with this is that the conclusions come first, is that we already believe the conclusion to be correct, because we thought of them. We don't know why we really came to them. It's maybe not that easy for us to explain why we chose Steve to be a librarian, even if we know that there are a lot more farmers than librarians. So, because we already believe in our conclusion, we automatically assume that the arguments that follow are correct. It's a bit like James Bond shooting first and asking questions later. This is what our mind does. We make conclusions, and then we try to think, how did we arrive at this conclusion? And then we try and make the arguments fit the conclusion. When in reality, we should be doing first the arguments and then the conclusion. And I think it was humbling also to see that even professionals, judges, they commit these systematic errors without realizing it. And that there's a lot more going on behind the curtains when we make decisions, when we jump to conclusions and things like that. Things that we are not really in control of. And I thought that was very humbling to see, and also to consider for my own future, to make sure that I evaluate things properly, and that there might not be things like blood sugar influencing my decisions in a way that is not good. And the thing we should always do, which is also common sense, you don't need to read the book to realize this, we need to always, of course, pause and check these snap judgments that we make. The mental effort to check is pretty minimal, but it's extremely valuable because the cost of not checking can be pretty high. But there are so many examples in this book, like, it's ridiculous. And even like when they ask people that study statistics and study math and all these things, they still fall for all these biases because their mind makes shortcuts. They make shortcuts in order to answer questions that they're not really sure of. And these are predictable shortcuts, predictable biases. So we really need to be aware. We need to double check our conclusions. And the thing is, it only takes 2 seconds. In some of the examples, a different example where it was, I don't remember, I believe it was an example where they mentioned a bat and some money or some things like that. And just by asking the test subject, so to say, to take 2 seconds to think of their reasoning, most of them, or a huge percentage of them, already immediately realized their mistake. So on one side you have almost everyone doing the mistake, doing wrong, on one side you have people taking 2 seconds, like literally like 2 seconds, to just think of their own reasoning, and they immediately see their mistakes. So we need to be aware, and we need to keep these 2 seconds in mind when doing decisions. And the book is full of surprising insights. I highly recommend it. And if you're ever up for parole, aim for the time that is just after the judge has eaten, because this is going to give you the highest chance of parole, if you ever find yourself in that situation. And that was all for me today. I might do some other videos about this book, but for the moment that's it, and I hope you enjoyed. Bye.